Video lesson 3.2. This video will overview World War I. So I'm going to start at the beginning. After we looked at the causes already, we simulated the causes, and you should have already gotten most of this content, but there are just a few specific things that I want to clarify and to go over that are important to know. And this will be our second video, so that's why it's 3.2. There will also be another video on the Russian Revolution coming up, and a last one to end out the unit. But this should help you with your paper. Okay, so 1914, right? Europe, the war begins. So we have our Western Front, as you can see, in France, and this is located in France, but as you'll see, there are obviously two sides of a battle, and so that is France and the United Kingdom versus Germany. And the Eastern Front is Russia on the eastern side, and Austria-Hungary and Germany on the western side. So Germany is fighting on both fronts, so they are kind of split. But so you might think that they are kind of at a disadvantage. Now remember, the Schlieffen Plan was to come through Belgium, around through France, and then up through Austria-Hungary. Now, the Schlieffen Plan is called the Schlieffen Plan because it was just a plan. It wasn't actually what happened. So, we're going to get to that, but for now, remember that old-fashioned, think Civil War, Revolutionary War, muskets, those kinds of things, muskets, cannons, horses, that warfare, armies would line up and shoot at each other in straight lines, pretty much. And there would be fronts of a battle, but the battle would probably be over in a couple days. However, now we have new technology, and we're going to go over everything that was new in just a few slides. But a new technology meant that there needed to be a new kind of warfare. However, these commanders were used to fighting the old-fashioned way. So they did not start out World War I quite successfully because they established something that they thought was a good idea, which was called trench warfare. So trenches, which are basically ditches, were dug to protect soldiers from the advanced weaponry. So they could hide in their little kind of trench, and the trenches would be the supply lines, the communication lines. They would connect all the soldiers to each other and allow them to move on their front, but they did not really allow them to advance or retreat very well. So you can see we have, let's just say this is the Western Front, so the Allied powers are going to be on the west side, and the Central Powers, Germany, is on the eastern side, and in the middle it might look like a river or something like that, but it's actually land, and this was called no man's land. So all those other little lines that you see, this was taken from the air recently after World War I, and those are all the trenches. So you can see there's the front line trench, but then there's also trenches that go backwards so that people in the artillery behind and people who were in charge of communicating, people who were in charge of supplies, those kinds of things, those could all be passed on from one side of this army. So it was these intense networks of trenches. Now, these trenches did not have the greatest conditions, as you can see. It's kind of rainy in France and in Russia. It's very cold. So you can see that these trenches would obviously fill up with groundwater because they're the low point. And they would get muddy because the soldiers had to dig the trenches themselves. And a lot of people died in World War I, so there was that problem too. The other thing, they didn't have good indoor plumbing in the trenches or anything, so we didn't have great hygiene. There were lice, there were rats to feed off of the supplies. They were very cramped. One statistic I read said that there was, actually I believe it was in the video, was 1 soldier for every 4 inches of trench. Now, if you only had 4 inches to yourself, it would get pretty uncomfortable. The trenches flooded. There was rapid spread of disease because it was wet, it was cold, they were close together. There was decaying flesh, both animal and human. And the other condition was a condition known as trench foot. So trench foot is actually when your sock would become so wet and cold it would mix with frostbite, and your foot would start to decay basically in your shoe and sock because it was being cold and wet for so long. So this was known as trench foot. So the saying was, keep your feet dry or die. It was a very dangerous disease. You would lose your feet if you got it. But our friend here on the lower left, you can see how much water there was all the time. Okay, so the new technology that caused trench warfare. We had tanks in World War I, and you can just make a list of these in your notes. We had machine guns for the first time. We had chemical warfare. There was mustard gas and chlorine gas, and you can see the mask that the man operating the machine gun was wearing. That was what they used to protect themselves against chlorine gas. And they had this mask on them at all times, but they weren't always prepared for chemical warfare, so they weren't necessarily wearing it, and a lot of people basically suffocated to death. There were also rocket launchers, as you can see, basically giant cannons. Grenades for the first time. Airplanes for the first time. And significantly, we have submarines for the first time used in warfare, and steel warships. But the most important is the U-boat, which is the German submarine. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few battles here. Each of them are significant for different reasons, and there are a couple major turning points that I will mention, and then we'll end the war. So the Battle of the Marne was the first major battle in World War I. So this was in 1914. And this is where France actually stopped Germany and the Schlieffen Plan. So they caught them right after they went through Belgium. And because they violated Belgium's neutrality, Great Britain joined France at this site. So France and the British armies stopped Germany. And so the Schlieffen Plan was then unsuccessful, because they started building trenches. So as soon as they got to the Battle of the Marne, as soon as those two armies confronted each other, they decided to build trenches so that they could protect themselves from each other's massive weaponry. And this is really an example of how with trench warfare, there is little advancement, so little movement towards either side in territorial terms. They didn't get very far, so they didn't really win the battle necessarily, and there were a lot of deaths, a lot of deaths, and we're going to look at more numbers in a bit. The Battle of Verdun. This was 2 years after that, February 16th to February 1915 to December 1916. It was the longest battle of the war, 10 months, and one of the bloodiest engagements. 2 million men were fighting each other throughout the entire battle. Now this is just one battle. I'm a little stuck here. Oh. So Germany, with the Battle of Verdun, they could have admitted defeat, but their goal was to create a battle of attrition. So attrition just means like gradual bleeding out or gradual weakening of an army. Instead of actually defeating them, just chip away at them until they lose. So this is where they hope to bleed the French army white, which means no more blood left in their body, no more blood left in their army. In the end, however, they sustained almost as many casualties as the French. An estimated 328,000 men died, which is compared to the French 348,000 men. So we can see that this battle, February 1916 to December 1916. That makes sense. So we can see that this battle, almost 750,000 men died, and this is just in 10 months of the war that lasted 4 years. So this was really the greatest scale of death that these men and these countries and the world had ever seen. Then we have the Battle of the Somme, which was also in 1916. And this was significant because it showed a new strategy for trench warfare. So this was called the human wave. So when the attack began, the Germans dragged themselves out of their dugouts, manned their posts, and destroyed oncoming waves of the British infantry. What the British tried to do was go up over no man's land and into the German trenches. This was never done before in trench warfare. And so they decided to shake things up a little and try out a new strategy. It did not work for them very well. After the first day, they only gained 1.5 kilometers, about a mile. And the British had suffered 57,470 casualties. Casualties as men who died. Despite this, that was just after the first day, 60,000 people died on one side. Despite this, Great Britain pressed on with the attack until November 19th. So that was July 1st. They kept going for another 4 months after that. So the total losses tallied over 1 million people. So the British side, 419,654. German casualties, they don't really know for sure, but between 450,000 and 680,000, depending on the person you find the estimate from. So when the offensive was eventually called off, the British were still 3 miles short of their goal, which was Bapaume and Serre, part of their first day objectives. So on July 1st, they said, let's get there, and they were still 3 miles short of it after they had lost 500,000 men. And after Germany had also lost 500,000 men, which is crazy. That number from that one battle is about half of the total number of American lives that were even involved in the war, not only lost. Speaking of Americans, in the beginning, 1914, we wanted to remain neutral. Think about the simulation. The United States wasn't really involved at all except for in trade. So the war was happening in Europe. The U.S. did not really feel directly connected. They weren't being, Germany wasn't being aggressive towards them or anything. Neither was Austria-Hungary. Neither was Serbia. They weren't allied with UK or France. And both sides, both the Allied powers and the Central powers, benefited from the U.S.'s industrial strength. So the U.S. was able to trade with both sides. President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, was re-elected in 1916. He was first elected in 1912. And he was re-elected on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of the war." And so that really signifies why the American people liked Woodrow Wilson, because he kept them out of World War I. So, why does the U.S. join World War I? There are two main reasons that we are going to get to. And the first is known as unrestricted submarine warfare. So according to international law, civilian ships, which are non-military ships, must be warned before they are sunk. So this allows for civilian passengers to escape safely. So they just must be warned. They can't stop it at all. They can try to avoid it. But at this time period, it was pretty hard to avoid. But they could send their passengers out on lifeboats. However, Germany was not doing this. They were not following international law. And all these countries had agreed to follow this international law. All the countries that had submarines or had industrialized, they agreed to this law. So one notable experience of this was the British passenger liner called the Lusitania that set sail from New York carrying American citizens. It was going from America to Great Britain. And it was sunk without warning on May 7th, 1915, off the coast of Ireland. So it was in the North Sea, which was fair game for war. However, there were 1,198 lives that were lost, and 128 of those lives were American citizens. So the Germans claimed that the Lusitania was carrying contraband, illegal war materials such as guns and ammunitions, from America to Britain. And in the end, it was. However, 128 U.S. citizens were still killed by the sinking of the Lusitania without warning, so America was not happy about this. Here is a very dramatic painting of the sinking of the Lusitania. You can see the lifeboats trying to get away. Almost looks like the Titanic, but you can see it's actually blowing up because it was bombed by submarines, torpedoes. And this poster is also representative of Americans wanting to get back at the Germans for the Lusitania. It says, "Shall this continue? Join the Navy." So, do you want another Lusitania to happen? Join the Navy. We need to pick up our arms and get back at the Germans, even though we're not in war with them yet. So this picture, you can see the Lusitania in the background. So Germany, despite its promises, sunk another ship, which was called the Sussex, and this killed only 2 Americans, but total, that means 200 Americans were lost at sea due to Germany breaking the law. So President Wilson protested, and Germany issued the Sussex Pledge. So they pledged not to sink merchant or passenger ships without warning and without saving human lives. Now, do we think Germany followed this rule? No. Germany broke their Sussex Pledge on February 1st, 1917, and they continued their unrestricted submarine warfare. 3 months later, another thing happens. This is our second major reason. Germany issues the Zimmermann Telegram in March of 1917. So this basically said that if the U.S. entered the war against the Central Powers, Mexico should attack the U.S. and receive Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as a reward. So basically, if Germany kind of felt us getting angry at all this unrestricted submarine warfare, and so they said, okay, if they declare war on us, you should attack them so you can distract them, and they can also fight 2 fronts. However, we intercepted this telegram, we broke the code, and we were outraged. So, in April of 1917, a month after the Zimmermann Telegram, and after years of unrestricted submarine warfare, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. Officially, on April 6th, 4 days later, Congress declares war. Now, if you might remember, Congress is the only power that can actually declare war. So also in 1917, Russia dropped out due to internal conflict, so due to a civil war, and their atrociously significant losses. So our next video is going to be all about Russia, so we'll come back to that and why that's a significant turning point in the war. So in 1917, the U.S. could only muster up 100,000 men for entrance to war. So think about this number. That's about 1/3 of the people that died on one side of one of the battles of the war. So President Wilson initiated conscription, which is also known as a military draft. So that means men were randomly selected to go to war, and this was the first time this was done. By the time the war ended on November 11th, 1918, more than 2 million American soldiers had served on the battlefields, and some 50,000 of them had lost their lives. That is not nearly as significant a number as the European powers lost in the war, but we were only in the war for about a year and a half. But we had dramatic economic effects. So we basically saved Great Britain and France from bankruptcy because all their money was going to American supplies anyway, so we just provided the supplies and the fighting, and we helped them from losing the war itself. So in the end, we came out pretty much on top with Great Britain and France right behind us because we all won the war.